The ground beneath Sanctuary Prime had held secrets for millions of years, and in a single moment, those secrets were unleashed with a fury that would reshape the landscape forever. Dowans. Charges detonated in perfect sequence along the fault lines he had mapped during the past week, and the Earth itself seemed to scream as it tore itself apart. The main Krathver hive had stood for months as a monument to conquest and terror, and it disappeared into the ground in less than 30 seconds. 12,000 demons died without ever understanding what was happening, as the structure they had built collapsed into a chasm that swallowed everything within a kilometer radius. The shockwave knocked the pursuing Krathver off their feet and sent Commander Siang's team tumbling across the broken terrain like leaves in a hurricane. She hit the ground hard enough to crack ribs and kept moving before the pain could register fully in her mind. "Everyone up," she shouted through the dust and chaos, "and run toward the extraction point now." The surviving members of Bravo Team staggered to their feet and ran with everything they had left, knowing that the confused and scattered Krathver behind them would recover soon enough. The Earth continued to shake beneath their feet as secondary collapses spread outward from the main crater, and more than once they had to leap across gaps that opened suddenly in their path. Private Sujin Yoon was running beside Commander Siang when a section of tunnel beneath them gave way without warning. Young soldier's reflexes saved her from falling into the darkness below, but her leg caught on a jagged edge of broken stone as she scrambled for solid ground. "Go!" she shouted to the soldiers behind her as she realized her leg was trapped and the tunnel was still collapsing around. Commander Siang turned back and grabbed her arm, trying to pull her free before the ground swallowed them both. "That is an order, Commander," Yoon said with a calm that seemed impossible given the circumstances. "And you need to get the others out of here." The tunnel groaned and shifted, and Yoon made a decision that would haunt the survivors for years to come. She pulled a grenade from her belt and shoved Commander Siang backward with her free hand, using strength that came from somewhere beyond normal human limits. "Tell my family I did something that mattered," she said just before the tunnel collapsed completely and took her with it. There was no time to mourn and no time to stop, so Siang forced herself to keep running while something inside her died along with the young soldier. She could not save. The extraction point was less than a kilometer ahead when Staff Sergeant Jaewon Lim stumbled and fell. And this time, it was not the ground that betrayed him. A Krathver blade had caught him during the initial chaos of the earthquake, and he had been running on pure adrenaline and willpower for the past 10 minutes. "Sergeant Lim is down," someone called out, and 2 soldiers immediately moved to carry their wounded comrade. The shuttle came into view just as the first of the surviving Krathver caught up to them, and what followed was a desperate fighting retreat that cost 2 more soldiers their lives. Corporal Ju-Soo Kang stood at the shuttle ramp and laid down covering fire that would have been impressive from a crew-served weapon, let alone a single soldier with a rifle. "Get him inside," she screamed as Lim was carried past her onto the shuttle. "And everyone else needs to move faster." The shuttle lifted off with Krathver claws scraping against its hull, and Kang was the last soldier to make it aboard before the ramp sealed shut behind her inside the crowded shuttle. Commander Siang counted heads and felt her heart break with each number. She reached Ed 29 had gone to the detention facility with Alpha Team, and all 29 were accounted for along with 287. Velith Civilians 12 had gone to the hive with Bravo Team, and she could only see 8 faces looking back at her through the blood and dust. 42 soldiers had landed on Sanctuary Prime 10 days ago, and only 37 were leaving. But then she looked at the civilians, at the silver-skinned Velith, who were holding each other and crying with relief after weeks of unimaginable terror. She looked at the children, who would grow up because the 77th had decided their lives were worth more than safe odds and reasonable calculations, and she knew that her soldiers had not died for nothing. Staff Sergeant Lim was lying on a stretcher near the back of the shuttle, and the medic's expression made it clear that there was nothing more to be done for him, Seong knelt beside him and took his hand. And he smiled up at her with the peaceful expression of someone who had made peace with what was coming. "Did we get them all?" he asked in a voice that was barely more than a whisper. "Every single one," she replied while fighting to keep her voice steady. "And they are safe because of what we did today." Lim nodded slowly and turned his head to look out the small window at the planet shrinking below them. "Good," he said simply. "That is good." He was still smiling when he died a few minutes later, and Seong closed his eyes with hands that trembled despite her best efforts to control them. The shuttle docked with the Veloth transport ship 3 hours later, and the survivors of the 77th walked into a reception that none of them had expected. Word had spread across the galaxy faster than they could have imagined, carried by the Veloth who had witnessed the battle and by sensor data that had been intercepted by a dozen different intelligence agencies. The demons had been broken, not defeated in a single battle or forced to retreat from a contested position, but truly broken in a way that no one had ever accomplished before. The main hive was gone along with 12,000 Krathvor, and the surviving 8,000 had scattered across Sanctuary Prime without leadership or coordination. More importantly, the myth of Krathvor invincibility had been shattered forever, and species across the galaxy were suddenly looking at the demons with new eyes. If 42 humans could do this, then perhaps the Krathvor were not as terrifying as everyone had believed. For so long, Commander Seong did not feel like a hero as she led her soldiers off the shuttle. She felt tired and broken and haunted by the faces of the 5 soldiers she had left behind on that world. But she also felt something else, something that had been forged in the fire of the past 10 days, pride not in herself, but in the men and women who had followed her into impossible odds, because they believed that some things mattered more than survival. 3 months later, a Krathvor delegation arrived at Crucible 7, and every mercenary in the station reached for their weapons when the demons walked through the main entrance. But the Krathvor had not come to fight. They had come to surrender, or at least the closest thing to surrender that their species was capable of offering. The delegation requested a formal meeting with representatives of the human species, and they asked specifically for Commander Yuna Seong to be present for the negotiations. She faced them across a conference table with the same calm expression she had worn when she accepted the contract that everyone said would kill her and all of her soldiers. "We wish to propose a non-aggression treaty between our species," the Krathvor ambassador said in a voice that carried none of the usual confidence his kind displayed. "We will not attack human worlds or human interests, and we ask only that you agree to the same terms in return." The other species present in the room stared in disbelief at what they were witnessing. The Krathvor had never negotiated with anyone. They conquered or they died, and those had been the only 2 options for as long as anyone could remember. "Why?" Seong asked simply, cutting through the diplomatic formalities to the question that everyone wanted answered. The ambassador was silent for a long moment before responding in a tone that held something no one had ever heard from a Krathvor before: fear. "We are called demons because we are what other species fear," he said slowly, as if choosing each word with extreme care. "We have built our civilization on being the predators, and we have never encountered anything that made us question that identity." He paused and looked directly at Seong with eyes that had witnessed things he still could not fully process. "We do not know what to call the humans. We only know that when we close our eyes, we see your kind smiling in the dark, and we hear the screams of our warriors echoing in our dreams. Even demons have nightmares, Commander Seong, and now we know what ours look like." The treaty was signed that day, and it held for longer than anyone expected. The 77th Reaper Division continued taking impossible contracts for another decade. Though their reputation changed after Sanctuary Prime, they were no longer just the soldiers who took jobs no one else would touch. They were the soldiers who had broken the demons and lived to tell about it. and somewhere in the vastness of space, the Krathver told stories to their young about the small and soft creatures who had taught them the true meaning of fear. They called them the nightmare species, and they warned their children never to underestimate what humans could accomplish. When they decided that something was worth fighting for, because even demons learned eventually that some prey bites back harder than any predator can handle, and by then it is always far too late to run. The night before the final assault was quiet in ways that seemed wrong for a world that had known nothing but screams and death for weeks. Commander Siang sat alone on a broken wall overlooking the distant glow of the Krathver hive, and she did not turn around when she heard footsteps approaching from behind. "You should be resting," Lieutenant Han said as she settled onto the wall beside her commanding officer. "Because tomorrow is going to be the longest day of our lives, or the shortest," Siang replied with a slight smile that did not quite reach her eyes. Depending on how things go. They sat in silence for a moment before Han spoke again in a voice that carried weight beyond the simple words. She chose 12 against 20,000 is not a distraction, Commander, and we both know exactly what you are asking those soldiers to do tomorrow. Siang nodded slowly, without taking her eyes off the distant hive that pulsed with alien light in the darkness. "I know," she admitted quietly, "and I know that some of them will not come back no matter how well we execute the plan." "Then why?" Han asked in a tone that held no judgment but genuine need to understand the reasoning behind decisions that would cost lives. "Because 300 civilians are waiting in that detention facility, and they have been living in terror for weeks while the galaxy decided they were not worth saving." Siang finally turned to look at her, second in command with eyes that held something fierce and unbreakable. Despite the exhaustion that lined her face, every mercenary group on Crucible 7 looked at those Velith and saw a lost cause. And they walked away because the math did not make sense to them. But some things matter more than math, Lieutenant. And some fights are worth taking even when the odds say you cannot win. Han considered this for a long moment before nodding once and rising to her feet. "Then we make sure it counts," she said firmly. "And we bring home everyone we can while making the demons pay for every centimeter of ground. Get some sleep, Commander. Because tomorrow you need to lead 12 soldiers into hell, and I need to lead 29 to salvation." Dawn came too quickly, and not quickly enough. And the 77th assembled for final briefings with the quiet efficiency of soldiers who had made peace with whatever was coming. Alpha Team would approach the detention facility from the east, while Bravo Team launched their assault on the main hive from the opposite direction. The timing had to be perfect because even a few minutes of delay could mean the difference between success and total failure for both teams. "Commander," Siang addressed her soldiers one final time with words she had spent the night preparing. In her mind, "I am not going to stand here and tell you that everyone is coming home," she said in a voice that carried clearly to every soldier present, "because we all know that might not be true. What I will tell you is that 300 people are counting on us today, and they do not care about our odds or our survival rates or any of the numbers that said this mission was impossible. They only care that someone finally came to help them. And today we are going to prove that their faith was not misplaced." She paused and looked at each of her soldiers in turn before finishing with words that would stay with the survivors for the rest of their lives. "Whatever happens today, remember that we chose this, and we chose it because that is who we are. Now let us go remind the demons why they should have stayed on their own worlds." Bravo Team reached their assault position as the sun climbed higher over the corrupted landscape, and the main hive loomed before them like a mountain of darkness and death. 12 humans crouched in the shadows and checked their weapons one final time while their targets numbered in the tens of thousands just beyond the outer perimeter. Sergeant B carried enough explosives to level a small city, and he had volunteered for the most dangerous part of an already suicidal mission. On my signal, Commander Seong said through the communication channel that linked all 12 soldiers. We hit them with everything we have, and we do not stop until Alpha Team confirms extraction. Remember that we are not trying to win this fight. And we are not trying to survive it either. If survival means letting those civilians die, we are trying to make every single demon on this planet forget about everything except killing us. And that means we need to hurt them badly enough that their rage blinds them to anything else. She took a deep breath and keyed the detonator for the first wave of explosives that Do-hwan had planted during the past week. Signal sent. Weapons free, and may whatever gods exist forgive us for what we are about to do. The outer wall of the hive disappeared in a ball of fire and debris that sent chunks of alien architecture flying for hundreds of meters in every direction. Bravo team moved through the chaos with weapons blazing, and the Krathver responded to this unprecedented attack with exactly the fury that Seong had been counting on. Thousands of demons poured out of the damaged hive, their screams of rage echoing across the battlefield as they sought to overwhelm the tiny force that had dared to strike it there. Hard, the humans fell back in a fighting retreat, drawing the enemy away from the hive and toward prepared positions where more explosives waited to thin their numbers. Sergeant Cho activated his psychological warfare systems and filled the air with recorded death screams that drove the already enraged Krathver into a frenzy of mindless aggression. 3 kilometers away, Lieutenant Han watched the distant explosions and knew that her commander was buying them time with blood. Alpha Team, move now, she ordered through her own communication channel. And do not stop for anything until we reach those civilians. The detention facility was lightly guarded compared to the main hive because the Krathver had not expected anyone to care about the prisoners they kept as Fear Generators 29. Humans hit the facility like a precision strike, eliminating the guards with ruthless efficiency before they could send a warning to the main force. Sergeant Beak had transferred to Alpha Team at the last moment on Commander Seong's orders, and his heavy weapons cleared the main entrance in seconds. Civilians located, Private Yoon reported as she reached the holding cells where nearly 300 Velith huddled in terror. And they are alive but in bad shape. The silver-skinned aliens stared at their rescuers with expressions that mixed disbelief with desperate hope. And several of them began crying when they realized what was happening. Everyone up and moving. Lieutenant Han commanded as her soldiers began cutting through the cell doors. Because we have a very short window to get you out of here. The evacuation proceeded smoothly for the first 5 minutes until a group of Krathver guards returned from patrol and discovered what was happening at the facility. They were supposed to protect. Sergeant Beak saw them coming and made a decision that he knew would likely cost him his life. Go, he shouted to the soldiers escorting civilians toward the extraction point. I will hold them here. He positioned himself in a narrow corridor that the Krathver would have to pass through to reach the evacuating civilians, and he opened fire with everything he had. Demons charged at him with claws extended and screams that should have sent him running for his life. But he held his ground and kept firing. One of them got close enough to slash his chest open with venomous claws, and he responded by shoving a grenade into its mouth before kicking it back toward its companions. Explosion bought him a few more seconds, and those seconds became minutes as he fought with the desperation of someone who had already accepted that he was not leaving this corridor alive when the last civilian cleared the facility. Beak was still fighting on one knee with blood pooling around him from wounds that would have killed a weaker person minutes ago. Lieutenant Han's voice came through his communicator with words that cut through the haze of pain and exhaustion. Sergeant Beak, the civilians are clear, and you need to fall back now. He looked at the corridor full of dead Krathver and the fresh wave of demons charging toward his position. And he smiled despite everything. Negative. "Lieutenant," he replied in a voice that was already growing weak, "I will hold them here as long as I can. Just make sure those people get home safe. And tell the commander that I was honored to serve with the 77th. He propped himself against the wall and raised his weapon one final time as the demons reached his position at the main hive. Commander Seong heard the report and felt something break inside her chest that she could not afford to examine right. "Now, Alpha Team has the civilians," she announced to her remaining soldiers as they continued their fighting retreat. "And now it is time for us to get out of here." But between them and the extraction point stood 10,000. Very angry Krathver, who had finally realized that the main attack was a distraction. Singh checked her ammunition and found that she had perhaps 3 magazines remaining for her primary weapon. "Sergeant Park," she called through the communication channel, "please tell me those charges are ready." Dawan's voice came back strained, but steady as he confirmed what she needed to hear. "Ready on your command, Commander. Though I should point out that the blast radius will be extremely dangerous for anyone within 2 kilometers of the hive, including us." Seong looked at her soldiers and saw the same understanding in their eyes that she felt in her own heart. They had always known this might be a one-way trip, and they had come anyway because that was who they were. "Trigger the charges," she ordered, "and then we run like hell and hope that." 7 days had passed since the 77th Reaper Division landed on Sanctuary Prime. And in that time, the Krathver had learned something that no conquered species had ever taught them before. They had learned what it felt like to be hunted. The first supply convoy disappeared on the 3rd day, and the Krathver assumed it had simply encountered mechanical difficulties somewhere along the route between the hive and the outlying territories. When the second convoy vanished the following day, they sent a search party to investigate. And that search party never returned either. On the 5th day, a senior officer was found dead in his own quarters, throat cut so cleanly that the guards outside his door never heard a sound from within. The Krathver did not understand how this was possible because they had sensors and patrols and every security measure that had kept them safe on 11 conquered worlds before this one. But somehow the humans slipped through every defense like water through cracks in stone, striking without warning and vanishing before anyone could respond to the attack. Sergeant Minho Cho had spent years studying psychological warfare, and he understood something fundamental about the Krathvor that their previous victims had never figured out. The demons built their entire society on being the predators, and every aspect of their culture reinforced the belief that they were the most terrifying things in any environment. They entered. Their fear screams and their venom and their brutal tactics all served the same purpose of establishing dominance through terror, and it had worked perfectly against every species they had ever encountered until now. Minho had captured recordings of Krathver death screams during the first patrol engagement, and he had spent hours analyzing the frequencies and patterns until he understood exactly how to weaponize them. On the 6th night, he set up speakers around Krathver outpost and played those death screams on repeat for 4 hours straight while the humans watched from a safe distance. Demons inside the outpost did not sleep that night, and by morning they were jumping at shadows and snapping at each other with a nervous energy that bordered on panic. They have never heard their own kind die like that, Minho explained to Commander Seong as they observed the results of his psychological operation through long-range scopes. Every species they conquered died screaming in fear, but those screams meant victory to the Krathver, and they learned to enjoy the sound. Hearing their own warriors scream in death instead of triumph is something completely outside their experience, and their minds do not know how to process it. The commander nodded slowly as she considered the implications of what her psychological warfare specialist, had discovered about their enemy's hidden weakness. "Can you do more?" she asked, in a tone that suggested she already knew the answer but wanted to hear him say it. Anyway, Minho smiled in a way that did not reach his eyes, and anyone who knew him well would have recognized that expression as extremely dangerous for whoever it was directed toward. "I can make them afraid to close their eyes at night," he replied simply. "And I can make them see humans in every shadow even when we are nowhere near their position. By the time we are ready to move on the hive, they will be so exhausted and paranoid that half of them will be combat ineffective before we fire a single shot." While Minho waged his war against the Krathver mines, Sergeant Do-hwan Park was conducting a different kind of operation entirely beneath the surface of Sanctuary. Prime, the tech specialist, had discovered something interesting about the geology of this planet during his initial scans, and he had spent the past week confirming his theory through careful investigation. The main Krathver hive had been built on ground that was far less stable than it appeared, with a network of fault lines running directly beneath the massive structure. They chose this location because it was the largest flat area near the capital, Do-hwan explained during a briefing on the 7th day. But they did not check what was underneath. If we place charges at specific points along these fault lines, we can trigger a cascading collapse that will bring the entire hive down into the earth. Lieutenant Han studied the geological maps that Do-hwan had prepared and felt her eyebrows rising as she realized the scale of what he was proposing. "You want to drop 20,000 Krathver into a hole," she said slowly, as if testing how the words sounded when spoken aloud. "Approximately 12,000 based on current population estimates," Do-hwan corrected with his usual precision. "And yes, that is exactly what I am proposing. The remaining 8,000 are distributed across the occupied territory in smaller outposts. But destroying the main hive will eliminate their command structure and breeding facilities." Commander Seong looked at the maps for a long moment before turning her attention to the other critical piece of information they had gathered during the past week. "What about the civilians?" she asked in a voice that reminded everyone present why they had taken this contract in the first place. "The Velith survivors are being held in a detention facility approximately 3 kilometers from the main hive," Lieutenant Han reported based on reconnaissance data gathered over several dangerous nights. "Current count is 287, down from 300 when we arrived, and they are being kept alive deliberately rather than killed immediately." "Why?" Private Yoon asked with a confused expression that showed she did not understand this behavior from creatures known for their absolute brutality. Minho answered her question with the clinical detachment of someone who had studied too many monsters to be surprised by their methods anymore. "The Krathver feed on fear as much as they feed on flesh," he explained quietly. "And keeping prisoners alive generates a constant supply of terror that they find." He paused to search for the right word before continuing his explanation in a tone that carried carefully controlled anger beneath its surface. "Delicious is probably the closest translation, though the concept does not map perfectly to human understanding of such things." The room fell silent as everyone processed this information and thought about the 287 Velith who had spent weeks living in constant terror for the entertainment of their captor's commander. Seong broke the silence with orders that left no room for questions or hesitation from anyone under her command. "We move in 3 days," she announced while pointing to key positions on the tactical display. "And we will split into 2 teams for the final operation. Alpha Team under Lieutenant Han will assault the detention facility and extract every single civilian, while Bravo Team provides a distraction at the main hive." "What kind of distraction?" Sergeant Beak asked from his position near the back of the room, already knowing he would not like the answer. The kind that makes 20,000. Crathra forget about everything except killing us. Commander Seong replied with a calm that seemed completely inappropriate given what she was describing. Bravo team will consist of 12 volunteers, and our job is to hit the hive hard enough that every demon on this planet comes running to stop us. That will give Alpha team the window they need to reach the detention facility, eliminate the guards, and get the civilians to the extraction point. The room remained silent as everyone considered what she was asking. And then Sergeant Beak stood up and walked forward to stand beside his commander. "I volunteer," he said simply without any hesitation or doubt in his voice. One by one, the others followed, until 12 soldiers stood ready to walk into almost certain death so that 300 strangers might have chance to live. Minho was the last to step forward, and he wore that dangerous smile again as he spoke. "Someone needs to make sure that demons hear their own screams one last time before the end." Commander Seong looked at her volunteers and felt something tighten in her chest that she could not afford to examine too closely. "Right now, get some rest," she ordered in a voice that almost succeeded in hiding her emotions. "Because in 3 days, we are going to teach the galaxy what humans are capable of when innocent lives are on the line." Outside the temporary base, the Crathver Hive commander was issuing orders of his own after a week of losses that had shaken his confidence for the first time in his long career. "All forces will consolidate at the main hive," he commanded, through the communication network that linked every demon on the planet. "These humans want to fight, and we will give them one they will never forget." His hands trembled slightly as he spoke, though he told himself it was anger rather than something he refused to name, even in the privacy of his own thoughts. The planet called Sanctuary Prime had earned its name from the Veloth colonists who had built their homes there over 3 generations of peaceful development and careful cultivation of the land. Now that name seemed like a cruel joke as the dropship descended through clouds that flickered with unnatural lightning, and the soldiers inside prepared themselves for what waited below. Sergeant Do-won Park had spent the entire journey modifying the ship's atmospheric processors to generate a massive electrical storm that would mask their approach from Crathver's sensors. The young tech specialist worked with a quiet intensity that the others had learned to respect over the years. And when he finally looked up from his console with a nod, the entire team knew they were ready. "Storm coverage will last approximately 4 hours. Do-won reported in his usual soft-spoken manner that never changed regardless of how dangerous the situation around him became. Commander Seong acknowledged this information with a brief nod of her own before turning to address her soldiers one final time before they touched down on enemy territory. "We have one objective," she said in a voice that carried clearly through the dropship despite the thunder rumbling outside. "And that objective is to bring those civilians home alive. Everything else is secondary to that goal. And I expect every single one of you to remember that when things get difficult down there." The soldiers of the 77th responded with a unified sound of acknowledgement that required no words. And then the dropship's landing gear made contact with the scorched earth of Sanctuary Prime. They moved out in perfect formation, spreading across the landing zone with weapons ready and senses alert for any sign of the enemy that had turned this world into a nightmare. The colony's capital city rose in the distance, and even from this far away they could see that it had been transformed into something terrible and wrong in ways that defied easy description. Buildings that had once housed families now twisted upward like organic growths, covered in a black substance that pulsed with a rhythm that suggested something alive and hungry lurked within the air. Carried a smell that several of the soldiers recognized from previous battlefields. Though none of them had ever encountered it at this concentration before, death hung over this world like a blanket. And the Krathver had made sure that every breath reminded visitors of what happened to those who challenged their dominion over conquered. Territory Corporal Jisoo Kang moved at the front of the formation, her compact frame hiding the strength that had earned her a reputation as the division's most dangerous close combat specialist. She raised one fist in the signal for halt, and the entire unit froze instantly without making a sound that might carry to hostile ears nearby. Movement ahead, she whispered through the communication system that connected all of their helmets. Approximately 200 meters at our 10 o'clock position. Commander Seong moved up beside her and activated her helmet's enhanced vision mode, scanning the indicated area until she found what Jisoo had detected moments earlier, a Krathvor. Patrol was moving through the ruins of what had once been a residential district. And even at this distance, the demons looked every bit as terrifying as their reputation suggested. Of them moved with a fluid grace that seemed impossible for creatures of their size, their black scales absorbing what little light filtered through the storm clouds overhead. Patrol leader suddenly stopped and raised its head, nostrils flaring as it sampled the air for scents that did not belong to the world it had claimed as its own. They caught our scent, Lieutenant Yoon Ji-han observed from her position further back in the formation, her voice calm despite the danger that observation implied. No, Dawan corrected quietly as he studied the readouts on his portable scanner. They detected something, but they do not know what it is yet. Humans are new to this region of space, and the Krathver have never encountered our species before, according to all available records. This was the advantage that Commander Seong had been counting on when she accepted this contract, and she intended to exploit it for as long as possible, weapons-free, she ordered through the communication channel. But make it fast and make it quiet. The 77th moved like shadows through the storm, closing the distance to the patrol with a speed and silence that would have impressed even the most experienced hunters in the galaxy. The Krathvor never saw them coming until it was far too late to do anything about the threat that had materialized around them without warning. Jisoo reached the first demon before it could raise the alarm, and her combat knife found the gap in its scales where the neck met the shoulder with practiced precision. The creature tried to scream, but only managed a wet gurgle before collapsing. And by then the rest of the patrol was already falling to the coordinated assault. One of the Krathver managed to turn and face its attacker, and it opened its mouth to release the psychic scream that had broken countless armies across dozens of conquered worlds. The sound hit the human soldiers like a physical force, vibrating through their bones and triggering every fear response that evolution had built into their nervous systems over millions of years. Private Soo Jin-yoon felt her heart racing and her hands trembling as the scream tried to convince her body that she was about to die and needed to run immediately. But she did not run. None of them ran. Instead, the young private gritted her teeth and pushed forward through the terror, raising her weapon and putting 3 rounds into the screaming demon's chest before it could understand why its attack had failed. The last Krathver standing was the patrol leader, and it found itself facing Corporal Kang in a space too confined for it to use its superior reach effectively. It slashed at her with claws that dripped venom capable of killing most species within minutes, and one of those claws caught her shoulder and tore through her armor like Papa Jisoo felt the venom enter her bloodstream and knew that she had seconds before the effects would begin to impair her combat effectiveness significantly. So she did what any sensible human would do in that situation. She stepped inside the demon's guard and slammed her forehead directly into its face with every ounce of strength her compact body could generate. The Krathver staggered backward in shock, and before it could recover, Sergeant Hee Woo-beek put a burst of fire through its skull from close range, Corporal Kang is hit. Someone called out as Jisoo swayed slightly on her feet, the venom already beginning to work its way. Through her system, the medic rushed forward with an anti-venom injection that Doan had synthesized during the journey based on captured Krathvor. Journey based on captured Krathvor. Biological data from previous encounters with other species. You headbutted a demon, Lieutenant. Han observed as she helped steady Jisoo while the anti-venom did its work. And I'm genuinely unsure if that was brave or insane. Both, Jisoo replied with a weak grin that looked slightly unsettling given the blood running down her face from a cut on her forehead. Definitely both. Commander Seong surveyed the aftermath of the brief engagement and found herself satisfied with what she saw despite the injury to one of her soldiers. 8 Krathvor dead in less than 30 seconds. And only one human wounded in an injury that would heal within days, thanks to their advanced medical technology. More importantly, they had learned something valuable about their enemy during this first encounter that would serve them well in the battles to come. They expected us to break when they screamed, she said to her gathered soldiers as they prepared to move out before reinforcements could arrive. And they did not know what to do when we refused. The demons have conquered 11 worlds, because every species they faced was afraid of them. And fear made those species weak and easy to destroy. We are going to teach them what happens when they face something that does not break. And by the time we are finished, they will understand why that was a mistake. The 77th vanished into the storm before the Krathvor reinforcements arrived, leaving behind 8 dead demons and a mystery that would haunt the Hive commander for days, somewhere in the occupied capital. A Krathvor officer reviewed the footage from a surviving patrol member's recording device and felt something cold settle in its chest. The prey creatures had not run when the fear scream hit them, and one of them had actually smiled before attacking. With renewed aggression, the officer had conquered 3 worlds personally and had never seen anything like this behavior from any species it had encountered. It filed a report to the Hive commander and included a single observation that would prove prophetic in the days ahead. These creatures do not respond to fear the way prey should. I recommend we learn more about them before engaging in larger numbers. The recommendation was ignored. That would prove to be a significant mistake. The space station called Crucible 7 floated in the darkness between 3 major trade routes, and every species in the galaxy knew its purpose well enough to either seek it out or avoid it entirely depending on their needs at any given moment. This was where the desperate came to hire soldiers, and where soldiers came to find work that paid well enough to justify the risks involved in taking it on behalf of strangers they would never see again after the contract ended. The main hall stretched for nearly a kilometer in every direction, filled with recruitment booths and negotiation chambers and bars where mercenaries spent their earnings before heading out to earn more or die trying to do so. Commander Yuna Seong sat alone at a corner table, watching the crowd with eyes that had seen too many battlefields to count anymore. And she nursed a drink she had no intention of finishing while she waited for something interesting to happen. Her 41 soldiers were scattered throughout the station, resting and resupplying after their last contract, and she had given them 3 days of leave before they needed to start looking for new work again. 77th Reaper Division had built a reputation over 5 years of taking jobs that other mercenary groups refused to touch. And they had the survival rate to prove they were worth every credit they charged for their services. That reputation was about to be tested in ways none of them could have predicted when the morning began so quietly and without any warning of what was coming their way. The commotion started near the main entrance, where a delegation of tall and thin aliens with silver skin and 4 arms each pushed through the crowd with obvious urgency, driving their every step forward. These were Velith, a species known throughout the galaxy for their peaceful nature and their complete lack of military capability, which made their presence on a mercenary station unusual enough to draw attention from everyone nearby. The delegation moved from booth to booth, speaking rapidly to each mercenary captain they could find, and every single conversation ended the same way, with the mercenaries shaking their heads and turning away. Yuna watched this pattern repeat itself 7 times before the Velith finally approached the largest booth in the hall, where the Kovathi Legion maintained their permanent recruiting presence with great pride and considerable arrogance. The Kovathi were insectoid warriors standing 3 meters tall with armored exoskeletons and blade-like appendages that could cut through steel, and they were considered the finest mercenary force in the known galaxy by most species. The conversation at that booth lasted longer than the others had, and Yuna found herself leaning forward slightly to observe the exchange, even though she could not hear what was being said from this distance when the Kovathi captain shook his massive head and gestured for the Velith to leave. The silver-skinned aliens seemed to deflate entirely, their forearms dropping to their sides in a posture of absolute despair and hopelessness. One of the Velith, older than the others based on the darker shade of his skin, sat down heavily on a nearby bench and buried his face in his upper hands while his lower hands trembled against his knees. Yuna stood up and walked over without making a conscious decision to do so, driven by something she could not quite name, but also could not ignore any longer than she already had. "You seem to be having trouble finding help," she said in a calm and even voice that carried no judgment or mockery in its tone whatsoever. The older Velith looked up at her with eyes that held more pain than she had seen in a long time. And when he spoke, his voice cracked with exhaustion and fear combined into something almost unbearable to witness. "Our colony world has been invaded," he said quietly enough that only she could hear his words clearly, "and we have tried everything we can think of to find someone willing to help us take it back." "Invaded by whom?" Yuna asked, though part of her already suspected the answer based on the reactions she had witnessed from the other mercenary groups throughout the morning. The Velith hesitated before answering, and when he finally spoke the single word that emerged from his mouth, it carried the weight of absolute terror behind every syllable that formed it. Krathver. Yuna felt her jaw tighten at the name, and she understood immediately why every mercenary in the station had refused to take this contract regardless of what payment might have been offered. The Krathver were nightmares given physical form, standing 2.5 meters tall with black scaled bodies and claws that dripped venom capable of killing most species. Within minutes of the slightest scratch, they moved like shadows and screamed at frequencies that triggered primal fear responses in nearly every sentient species that had ever encountered them, which had earned them the simple name that the galaxy used to describe them. Demons. The Krathver did not conquer worlds for resources or territory or any logical reason that other species could understand, and they did not negotiate or accept surrender or show any form of mercy to those they attacked. They simply consumed everything in their path and moved on to the next target, leaving nothing behind but empty ruins and the bones of those who had failed to escape in time. No military force had ever defeated them in ground combat, and the list of armies that had tried and failed included some of the most powerful species in the galaxy throughout recorded history. "How many colonists are still alive?" Yuna asked, and the question seemed to surprise the Velith enough that he straightened slightly before responding to her inquiry. 300 at last count," he said with a trembling voice that suggested he expected that number to decrease with every passing hour. "But we do not know how much longer they can survive." "How many Krathver are holding the planet?" "Our scans suggest approximately 20,000, though their numbers may have grown since we were forced to flee from our own homes. 20,000 demons against 300 helpless civilians. And every mercenary force in the galaxy had already decided that those odds made the mission impossible to complete successfully. Yuna thought about her soldiers, scattered throughout the station and enjoying their brief rest before the next job came along to test their skills and their luck. Once again, she thought about the 41 men and women who had followed her into hell more times than she could count and who trusted her to bring them home alive whenever possible. And she thought about 300 Velith civilians who would die screaming if no one stepped forward to help them, because the galaxy had decided that some missions were simply not worth attempting. Triple hazard pay, Yuna said in a voice that left no room for negotiation on that particular point. And you stay completely out of our way once we deploy. Velith stared at her with all four of his eyes widening in shock, and something that might have been the first hint of hope he had felt since this nightmare began. You would take this contract, he whispered, as if saying the words too loudly might somehow break the spell and make her change her mind about the offer she had just made. I am Commander Yuna Seong of the 77th Reaper Division, she replied while extending her hand in the human gesture of agreement. And we specialize in impossible jobs. 3 hours later, the 77th had assembled in the station's docking bay, loading equipment onto their dropship with the efficient speed of soldiers who had done this many times before. A crowd had gathered to watch them prepare, and most of the faces in that crowd wore expressions of pity mixed with disbelief at what they were witnessing. A grizzled Corvathi mercenary pushed through the crowd and approached Yuna with something that might have been respect or might have been pity showing in his compound eyes. The demons broke our legion's finest force last year, he said in a deep and rumbling voice that echoed slightly in the enclosed space. And 5,000 of our best warriors died in a single day. Yuna finished checking her weapon and looked up at him with a slight smile playing at the corners of her mouth as she considered how best to respond to his warning. How many humans are you bringing to fight 20,000 Krathver? The Corvathi continued when she did not immediately reply to his first statement. 42. Yuna answered simply without any trace of doubt or fear in her voice. The Corvathi made a sound that might have been a laugh or might have been a prayer for the dead, and he shook his massive head slowly from side to side. Then you are already dead, Commander, and I'm sorry that your species will lose so many warriors for nothing. Yuna turned to face him fully, and the smile on her face grew just slightly wider as she spoke her final words before boarding the dropship that would carry them to war. Then it is almost a fair fight.